Tonight, we're not wandering through the musings of some philosopher. We're marching onto a battlefield, but not the polished Hollywood version with sparkling armor, majestic horse charges, and slow-motion heroics. No, this is the real deal. Mud, chaos, sweat, terror, and steel. Medieval combat, as it actually was. And, spoiler it, looked nothing like the movies. Before we jump in, make sure you're settled. If you enjoy this kind of deep dive, consider subscribing, but only if it's genuinely your thing. Drop a comment to where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now. It's always wild to see how far across the world these stories reach. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft white noise, and let's step into the past together. You wake to a sound somewhere between a horn and a man screaming march, like he's owed 3 months of rent. There's no snooze, no bed, no comfort, just wet earth under your bones and the spiritual misery of having slept in armor. You stretch, instantly regret it, because your mail shirt has bonded with your body like a needy ex. Around you, other soldiers stir, all with the same broken expression. One guy still passed out, with his face in a rain-filled helmet. Another is trying to stab a slug out of his boot. Breakfast is an insult to the concept of food. A rock-hard hunk of bread, tough enough to block arrows, probably baked last Easter. You chew slowly, not because it's good, but because your jaw is still sore from yesterday's mystery meat stew. And what do you wash it down with? It's warm ale, because water is basically medieval roulette with bacteria. Grooming, forget it. You haven't seen your own face in weeks, sand. That's probably for the best. You splash swamp water on your cheeks, pretending it counts as washing up. Then, strap yourself back into gear that smells like fermented terror. Orders park out, form up, move out, shouted by some noble on a horse who's never trudged a mile in armor. The whole army groans and clanks into motion. Someone immediately steps barefoot on a sharp rock and limps for the rest of the day. The mud clings to your boots like it wants your soul. You're already starving, aching, soaked, and regretting every choice that led you here. And this is considered one of the better mornings. Still, you march, not because you want to, but because not marching means being called a deserter, and desertion tends to end with something sharp, chopping off something important. Each step is a slog through muck that adds less soil and more wet misery. Stop for even a second, and the man behind you looks ready to bite your face off. Armor wasn't designed for hiking. It chafes, it pinches, it grinds. Your shoulders are screaming, your thighs are burning, and your inner thighs have staged a rebellion. You're basically a human iron sausage, slow cooking in sweat. The air smells of livestock, onions, and raw fear. Someone farts with enough force to traumatize the column. You switch to mouth breathing, huge mistake. You trudge past a crushed hedgehog, a broken wagon, and what might have once been a toe. Nobody stops. Nobody dares. The sergeant screams constantly. Yelling is now his whole identity. Morale doesn't exist. Some men chant songs to cope, others whisper prayers. One guy just howls into the wind. No one stops him. It helps. You briefly dream the enemy might just give up, but then, remember, they're probably hoping the same thing. Which means this will end the usual way. Panic, screaming, stabbing, and you trying desperately to remember which end of the spear goes forward. After endless hours, a hill rises ahead. Of course it does. Every medieval battle is fought on some cursed hill. Soldiers slip and tumble down. Nobody helps. Honestly, they're better off. Still, you climb and climb until finally you reach camp. If you imagined tents and order, forget it. Unless you're a knight, camp is just mud slightly less cursed than the mud beside it. You claim your patch of earth by collapsing on it. Congratulations, you've founded a trench village. The stench is immediate and horrifying. Wet wool, rot, sweat, and despair. Flies swarm. Some of them feel like old friends at this point. The latrine is a shallow pit, dug with more regret than effort. Privacy doesn't exist. The smell is Old Testament levels of awful. You eat a bowl of stew that tastes like gray. You ask what's in it. Cook just stares at you, then walks away. You eat it anyway. Around you, some men sharpen blades. Others gamble with dice. A few pray very loudly, making sure everyone hears. Not devotion, just hedging bets that God's more likely to protect the loud ones. The soundtrack. Coughing, muttering, weeping, someone crooning badly about bread, and a would-be bard murdering a lute. A knight rides past, barking orders. His armor shines, and he smells faintly of lavender. Everyone instantly hates him. Night falls. You curl up in your damn cloak next to a guy who snores like he swallowed a donkey. Sleep won't come. Easily your mind spins through every possible way to die tomorrow, or tonight if that goat wandering to camp decides to kick your ribs again. Finally, your eyes start too close when a voice bellows across the darkness. Form up at sunrise. Another glorious morning greets you. The sun creeps up, and with it comes the frosty realization that you were probably about to die in a muddy field, likely before lunch. You haven't brushed your teeth. Not that you own a toothbrush or many teeth worth brushing. The horns blast. Men groan. Cue. Drag yourself out of a damp, lice-ridden blanket to see your fellow soldiers doing their best impression of enthusiasm. You shuffle into line because standing in neat rows creates the illusion of order, like arranging deck chairs on a sinking ship. It doesn't save you, but at least it looks tidy. And then he arrives, the noble commander. Gleaming armor polished so brightly you could signal ships with it. It's got that smug energy of someone who's never been punched in the face. He surveys you like a disappointed father who just discovered his child joined the wrong gang. He clears his throat. Everyone braces. Men, today we fight for glory. There's a dramatic pause. Someone near you coughs up something living. For our king, our homeland, our honor. The army mumbles back, but most of the noise is indigestion, not patriotism. Look to your brothers. Look to your steel. You glance sideways. The man beside you is trembling, wearing his helmet backwards, gripping a bent sword. The enemy fears us. They don't. They've probably got their own guy shouting the same speech, just with a different accent. If you fall today, yes, the cheerful part. You fall as heroes. You resist the urge to ask if you can instead fall later, maybe while working in a bakery. Then, inevitably, comes the God section. God is definitely on your side, though, considering the season, he seems to be smiting everyone indiscriminately. The speech ends with a dramatic sword raised to the heavens and a bellowed forward. Nobody moves. A couple of guys blink. One sneezes. The commander repeats himself until one poor soul shuffles ahead, and the rest reluctantly follow, not from conviction, but because standing still risks being volunteered, and everyone remembers what happened to the last volunteer. Thus ends the pep talk. Spiritually, you're now ready to panic with purpose. It's time to form ranks. Sounds impressive, disciplined, tactical, orderly. Reality. A confused clump of peasants vaguely facing the enemy. Half are still strapping helmets on. A few clutch weapons they borrowed 5 minutes ago. One man holds a pitchfork. You're fairly sure he just wandered in by mistake. Your sergeant, who was raising pigs not long ago, starts barking numbers. Nobody understands, but everyone nods like they do. Front line, shields locked. Second line, pikes forward. He roars. You comply, though the guy in front of you has his shield upside down and is scratching his back with it. On your left, a fella with a spear taller than himself keeps poking everyone around him. On your right, a man hums what's supposed to be a battle hymn, but it sounds suspiciously like Greensleeves with new words. Behind you, someone breathes dramatically, as if rehearsing death noises. He's not injured, just overly prepared. The cavalry waits off to one side, horses stamping, knights gleaming in armor worth more than your entire village. They look heroic. You're in hand-me-down boots and chainmail that smells like it's had a previous owner who didn't survive. Then the order comes. Tighten the line, move forward. Easier said than done when everyone is tripping on each other and the mud is trying to eat smaller soldiers alive. Your feet slide. Someone elbows you. Your shield flips backward, but fixing it feels like too much effort. Then the drumbeat begins, a slow, doom-laden thump that signals the real start. Around you, men whisper prayers. One man starts sobbing quietly. Q, politely ignore it. Too busy negotiating with your own mortality. You inhale, lift your weapon, and pray not to faint. Finally, the formation starts to resemble something intentionally. At least no one is walking the wrong way anymore. And that's when the sky betrays you. It begins as a faint rush of air, a hiss in the distance, swelling into a collective whisper of dread. Then the shout, shields up. You fumble, throwing your shield above you, while a man nearby is still puzzling over which edge is up. Sky darkens not with clouds, but with hundreds of arrows, flung with reckless enthusiasm from the enemy lines. And then they fall. Arrows don't glide gracefully like in films. They slam, they snap, they crunch into armor, bounce off, or bury themselves in places they have no business being: feet, thighs, and whatever fragile part of your sanity is left. The man ahead of you drops instantly, an arrow jutting from his shoulder like an oversized quill. Someone screams. Someone else curses in Latin or maybe just sneezes. Hard to tell through the panic. Here, this is only the beginning. You huddle behind your shield, which suddenly feels pathetically tiny and suspiciously homemade. An arrow smacks against it with a jarring clang, and just like that, this slab of wood and iron is now your dearest companion. Kia, you christen it Harold. You whisper promises to Harold that, should you survive, you'll never again complain about its crooked edges. On your left, a man is shouting curses at the archers. On your right, someone is being cursed, mostly because he forgot to duck. Behind you, another soldier yells that he's wounded, though you're fairly certain he's just auditioning for an early exit. Then the second wave of arrows comes. Whatever shred of calm existed vanishes instantly. Veterans crouch and mumble half-remembered prayers. Fresh recruits sob like children. One fellow simply flops to the ground and pretends to be a corpse. Honestly, it's not the worst tactic. At last, the sky clears. You're still alive. Harold has proven himself a hero. But there's no time to celebrate, because now comes the true nightmare: hand-to-hand combat. Sweaty, deafening, and very stabby. There's no countdown, no rousing drumbeat, no cinematic charge. One moment you're trembling in formation, the next you're shoved forward in a human avalanche. Not courage, it's just the reluctant momentum of men too scared to stop. Someone up ahead shouts something inspirational, immediately trips, and gets trampled. You don't stop to help, not out of cruelty, but because you'd be flattened too, and then you collide. Flesh slams into flesh, like sacks of potatoes stuffed with knives. Forget elegant swordplay. This isn't a duel. This is a grinder. You swing your weapon, maybe a sword, maybe an axe, maybe something that belongs in a kitchen. There's no aiming, no artistry, just flailing. Metal crashes, wood splinters, men grunt. Somewhere nearby, a soldier screams a single syllable over and over, as if repetition might make it a war cry. The fighting is intimate. You're suddenly aware of everything about the man across from you. His sweat, his stench, the faint aroma of onions on his breath. This personal space is a forgotten luxury. At one point, you jab downward and pray it wasn't your own foot. Your helmet fogs. You can't see. You can't breathe. Someone slams into your ribs and nearly knocks you flat. You glance at your gauntlets red. Whose blood? Hard to say. Doesn't matter. A blade swings at your head. You duck instinctively. It connects with someone else. The two of you exchange a quick glance. Half sorry. It's half better you than me. You tried to recall training, but the lesson was basically swing hard. Don't die. So you swing. Sometimes you connect. More often, you don't. Sometimes a man drops screaming. Sometimes he drops silently. You don't dare linger on either. This isn't the noble clash of steel from the ballads. This is the ugliest tavern brawl ever, only with 500 drunks, sharper weapons, and no one willing to play referee. And the noise, dear God, the noise. You thought it would be trumpets, maybe a clash of swords. Instead, it's chaos. Endless screaming, not just from the dying, but the living too. Men holler to pump themselves up, okay? They holler when stabbed. They holler when their toes get stumped. One poor soul yelps because he forgot which side he was on and is now attacking anything that moves, including shrubbery. The voices vary. High-pitched squeals from lads who should have stayed baking bread. Deep roars from hulking axemen. Nervous squeaks from a fellow realizing too late he's wearing the wrong banner. Somewhere in the back, a sergeant bellows, "Hold the line." With all the futility of a man commanding the ocean to sit down, no one hears. You don't hear. You're too busy flinching at the sound of your own bones clicking. Then come the weapons themselves. Swords slam into shields. Maces land with a sickening thud against flesh. Arrows whiz past with the exact tone of regret. Spears crack through armor, followed by screams that rearrange your spine. But the worst noise is not the shouting, not even the death cries, okay? The worst are the wet sounds, okay? The sloppy crunch of a boot sinking into what used to be a man, okay? The ugly slurp of blood and mud mixing beneath your feet. The grotesque squish when someone collapses and doesn't get back up. These sounds don't leave you. They move in. They take up permanent residence in the corners of your nightmares. A seasoned surgeon might pour wine over your wound to clean it. A less seasoned one might drink it first. You lower yourself with a slash across your thigh, clinging to the fragile hope it won't be your end. It's the barber surgeon, the same fellow who usually trims beards, gives your leg a quick glance and mutters, "We'll see." Then he produces a needle, sterilized by briefly waving it near a candle. You attempt to hold back your cry. You fail, loudly. Meanwhile, bodies are being hauled into uneven heaps. Some get covered, most don't. You recognize a face or two, but look away quickly. The stench is shifting from physical to spiritual. Flies arrive in a buzzing swarm, thrilled about their endless buffet. One lands directly on your open gash. You swat it off, then realize it's probably the cleanest thing you'll encounter all day. Elsewhere, men are reclaiming gear, which is just a polite way of saying looting. They dig through corpses for helmets, swords, boots, anything not nailed down or twitching. You don't judge. You do it too. You need new footwear, and Gregor isn't going to be using his anymore. Sorry, Gregor. Some dig shallow graves, others build crude pyres. One soldier simply sits in silence, a javelin still lodged in his arm. You offer help. He shakes his head. It's mine now. Bandages are tied. Some come undone within minutes. Infection is likely. Amputation probable. Death optional, depending on luck, timing, and whether the flies decide to take an interest. By sunset, the battlefield has quieted. The survivors limp back to camp, caked in mud, blood, and an unsettling sense that the worst isn't over. And technically, they're right. You've lived through it barely. You stagger away with all your limbs intact and just enough brain power to recognize your boots, which may not have been yours this morning. Now comes rest, which really means collapsing in a not quite swampy patch of ground and trying not to cry. Camp reeks worse than the battlefield. Somehow, the blended stench of sweat, blood, rancid stew, and roasted horse clings to the air like a curse. You find your spot and drop like a sack of onions. Around you, groans, screams, off-key singing, and one desperate man praying to 3 different gods, just in case. Nearby, a soldier wipes his sword with the shirt he's still wearing. The cook ladles out something that might be food. You accept a bowl of sludge that legally isn't soup, but emotionally counts. Its texture is regret. Its color is don't ask. You eat anyway. Dignity is long gone somewhere between the fifth volley of arrows and watching a man slapped to death by a confused horse. Sleep doesn't come. Your body aches, and the man beside you snores with the power of a collapsing cathedral. You toss, you shift, you end up wetter than before. You stare at the stars, pondering what crimes you committed in a past life to deserve this one. Occasionally, men limp into camp, dragging swords, muttering about next time. There's always a next time. Your commander strolls past, still polished, still spotless, still irritatingly alive. You hate him more than yesterday. And yet, you're alive too, bruised, filthy, half broken but alive. That's what passes for victory here. Tomorrow, it's back to hauling bodies, or worse, marching again. Surviving a medieval clash doesn't grant peace, it grants the right to sit by the fire. Cue, sip lukewarm ale, and start rewriting the day's horrors into half-true stories. 'Cause this is how it always ends. Not with a noble ceremony, not with bards singing your glory, but with battered men perched on damp logs, exaggerating. One swears he felled 6 knights with a frying pan. Another brags about catching an arrow mid-air and tossing it back. Someone else insists he fought a war elephant in France where no elephants exist. You nod, sip, and contribute. In your version, you didn't trip over a corpse strategically repositioned. That time, you crawled into a bush to avoid cavalry. A stealth maneuver. It's a part where you begged a squire to hold your hand under arrow fire. Omitted. Everyone's doing entry-shaping trauma into legend. It's less about boasting and more about survival. If you can laugh, maybe it won't scar. If you can lie, maybe the memory won't win. A questionable piece of meat roasts over the fire. No one asks what it is. Laughter breaks out, tin, cracked, but laughter all the same. A man strums a lute with missing strings. Camp follower mends a sleeve, humming as though the battlefield beyond the fire doesn't exist. You gaze into the flames. Somehow, you lived, coolly, accidentally, miraculously. Soon, you'll march again, stumble into another mess, another glorious clash. But tonight, there's warmth, bread, and the company of men who all know your story is just as false as theirs, okay? And for one fragile night, that's enough. Centuries before the Great Wall became the endless barrier slicing across northern China, the land was a patchwork of feuding states, each gnawing at the other for control. This was the warring states' Piriata relentless grind of battles, where 7 mighty powers bled for supremacy over the Chinese heartland. Each kingdom, distrustful of the others, threw up its own defenses, tamped earth, ramparts, timber walls, rough stone barriers. These were not part of some grand vision, but desperate local measures lines in the dirt daring rivals to cross. They were not just defenses, but declarations. This is mine. Take it if you dare. And the threats weren't only neighbors. To the north, beyond the fields and rivers, roamed nomadic horseman chief among them, the Zunu. Swift riders who seemed to vanish into the grasslands, striking villages, stealing herds, burning what they couldn't take. These weren't nuisances. They were existential dangers. Livestock gone, trade routes shattered, settlements erased overnight. So, the states did what they could. They built walls, not monuments of unity, but scattered barriers of survival. Each one a fragile hope against the wild beyond. A seasoned surgeon might pour wine over your wound to clean it. A less seasoned one might drink it first. You lower yourself with a slash across your thigh, clinging to the fragile hope it won't be your end. It's the barber surgeon, the same fellow who usually trims beards, gives your leg a quick glance and mutters, "We'll see." Then he produces a needle, sterilized by briefly waving it near a candle. You attempt to hold back your cry. You fail, loudly. Meanwhile, bodies are being hauled into uneven heaps. Some get covered, most don't. You recognize a face or two, but look away quickly. The stench is shifting from physical to spiritual. Flies arrive in a buzzing swarm, thrilled about their endless buffet. One lands directly on your open gash. You swat it off, then realize it's probably the cleanest thing you'll encounter all day. Elsewhere, men are reclaiming gear, which is just a polite way of saying looting. They dig through corpses for helmets, swords, boots, anything not nailed down or twitching. You don't judge. You do it too. You need new footwear, and Gregor isn't going to be using his anymore. Sorry, Gregor. Some dig shallow graves, others build crude pyres. One soldier simply sits in silence, a javelin still lodged in his arm. You offer help. He shakes his head. It's mine now. Bandages are tied. Some come undone within minutes. Infection is likely. Amputation probable. Death optional, depending on luck, timing, and whether the flies decide to take an interest. By sunset, the battlefield has quieted. The survivors limp back to camp, caked in mud, blood, and an unsettling sense that the worst isn't over. And technically, they're right. You've lived through it barely. You stagger away with all your limbs intact and just enough brain power to recognize your boots, which may not have been yours this morning. Now comes rest, which really means collapsing in a not quite swampy patch of ground and trying not to cry. Camp reeks worse than the battlefield. Somehow, the blended stench of sweat, blood, rancid stew, and roasted horse clings to the air like a curse. You find your spot and drop like a sack of onions. Around you, groans, screams, off-key singing, and one desperate man praying to 3 different gods, just in case. Nearby, a soldier wipes his sword with the shirt he's still wearing. The cook ladles out something that might be food. You accept a bowl of sludge that legally isn't soup, but emotionally counts. Its texture is regret. Its color is don't ask. You eat anyway. Dignity is long gone somewhere between the 5th volley of arrows and watching a man slapped to death by a confused horse. Sleep doesn't come. Your body aches, and the man beside you snores with the power of a collapsing cathedral. You toss, you shift, you end up wetter than before. You stare at the stars, pondering what crimes you committed in a past life to deserve this one. Occasionally, men limp into camp, dragging swords, muttering about next time. There's always a next time. Your commander strolls past, still polished, still spotless, still irritatingly alive. You hate him more than yesterday. And yet, you're alive too. Bruised, filthy, half broken, but alive. That's what passes for victory here. Tomorrow, it's back to hauling bodies, or worse, marching again. Surviving a medieval clash doesn't grant peace, it grants the right to sit by the fire. Cue, sip lukewarm ale, and start rewriting the day's horrors into half-true stories. 'Cause this is how it always ends. Not with a noble ceremony, not with bards singing your glory, but with battered men perched on damp logs, exaggerating. One swears he felled 6 knights with a frying pan. Another brags about catching an arrow mid-air and tossing it back. Someone else insists he fought a war elephant in France where no elephants exist. You nod, sip, and contribute. In your version, you didn't trip over a corpse strategically repositioned. That time, you crawled into a bush to avoid cavalry. A stealth maneuver. It's a part where you begged a squire to hold your hand under arrow fire. Omitted. Everyone's doing entry-shaping trauma into legend. It's less about boasting and more about survival. If you can laugh, maybe it won't scar. If you can lie, maybe the memory won't win. A questionable piece of meat roasts over the fire. No one asks what it is. Laughter breaks out, tin, cracked, but laughter all the same. A man strums a lute with missing strings. Camp follower mends a sleeve, humming as though the battlefield beyond the fire doesn't exist. You gaze into the flames. Somehow, you lived, coolly, accidentally, miraculously. Soon, you'll march again, stumble into another mess, another glorious clash. But tonight, there's warmth, bread, and the company of men who all know your story is just as false as theirs, okay? And for one fragile night, that's enough. Centuries before the Great Wall became the endless barrier slicing across northern China, the land was a patchwork of feuding states, each gnawing at the other for control. This was the warring states' period, relentless grind of battles, where 7 mighty powers bled for supremacy over the Chinese heartland. Each kingdom, distrustful of the others, threw up its own defenses: tamped earth, ramparts, timber walls, rough stone barriers. These were not part of some grand vision, but desperate local measures lines in the dirt daring rivals to cross. They were not just defenses, but declarations. This is mine. Take it if you dare. And the threats weren't only neighbors. To the north, beyond the fields and rivers, roamed nomadic horsemen, chief among them, the Zunu. Swift riders who seemed to vanish into the grasslands, striking villages, stealing herds, burning what they couldn't take. These weren't nuisances. They were existential dangers. Livestock gone, trade routes shattered, settlements erased overnight. So, the states did what they could. They built walls, not monuments of unity, but scattered barriers of survival. Each one a fragile hope against the wild beyond. Mao Zedong once declared, "He who has not climbed the Great Wall is not a true man," transforming what was once a decaying ruin into a patriotic pilgrimage. By the late 20th century, restoration efforts were underway, especially near Beijing. Crowds flocked to places like Beiling, rebuilt to reflect the grandeur of the Ming era. Meanwhile, other stretches remained wild and crumbling, surrendering slowly to wind and weeds. From neglected ruin to global emblem, the Great Wall had taken a remarkable path. No longer a military bulwark, it stood instead as a bridge to history, a reminder of what people can build when driven by fear, ambition, and visions that spanned centuries. Today, the Great Wall of China is one of the most iconic landmarks on Earth. Yet, most of what the world thinks and knows about it is steeped in myth and overstatement. It isn't one continuous wall, but a series of defenses built by different dynasties across the millennia, snaking through deserts, plains, and jagged peaks. It doesn't form an unbroken chain. And no, it's not visible from the moon. The truth, however, is far more compelling. The wall is less about bricks and battlements, and more about memory and meaning. It reflects a civilization's centuries-long struggle to define itself not only against outsiders, but against chaos within. It tells of emperors obsessed with control, peasants forced into brutal labor, and generals remembered less for victories than for the miles of fortification they oversaw. It was ambition etched into the earth, a scar that can still be traced from the sky. Throughout the ages, its meaning shifted. For rulers, it was authority made visible. For soldiers, it was a suffocating post of endless watch. For poets, it was a lonely landscape of wind and separation. And for modern China, it has become a national symbol, a testament to resilience, strength, and pride. Millions of visitors tread its paths, climbing restored battlements, gazing from ancient watchtowers. They come not only for the view, but for the legend that human will could create something so vast, so defiant, it would endure beyond dynasties and time itself. Yet much of the wall lies in ruin. Over 30% has already eroded, collapsed, or been dismantled. Preservation is now a race against storms, development, and neglect. The challenge today isn't building the wall, but saving what's left, keeping alive a past that stretches across centuries and continents. In the end, the Great Wall was never just about shutting enemies out. It was about marking the edge between civilization and wilderness, empire and uncertainty, the known and the feared. And in doing so, it transcended its function. K became legend. Stone by stone, tale by tale, the wall endures not only in the northern hills of China, but in the shared imagination of the world. The year was 1860, and the United States teetered on the edge of both greatness and fracture. Civil War loomed, California boomed with gold fever, and one problem was painfully clear. The nation's growth was outpacing its communications. The East buzzed with telegram wires and railways, but the West might as well have been another continent. A letter from Missouri to California could take 3 to 4 weeks, assuming snow, bandits, or collapsing bridges didn't delay it further. For a nation enthralled with manifest destiny, waiting a month for word of gold shipments or Lincoln's nomination was intolerable. Alternatives existed: steamships sailing around Cape Horn or through the Panama Isthmus, but they were slow, costly, and perilous. What America needed was speed. Enter the Pony Express. Daring, reckless, and perhaps impractical. The plan was straightforward. Place lean, lightweight riders on horseback, racing day and night across nearly 2,000 miles of wilderness. Relay stations every dozen miles, fresh mounts ready in minutes, and no excuses through rain, snow, or arrows. Suddenly, Missouri to California mail would take under 10 days. Outlandish. Yes, but so was the idea of a transcontinental railroad, and like that dream, this one caught fire. Behind the scheme were not outlaws or soldiers, but businessmen. William H. Russell, Alexander Majors, and William B. Waddell, veterans of the freight trade. They hauled supplies to army posts across the frontier, but contracts were dwindling and the economy shaky. Desperate, they gambled on speed. New company had a clunky name, Central Overland California and Pike, Peak Express, but the press quickly gave it one that stuck: the Pony Express. The route stretched nearly 2,000 miles from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California, across mountains, deserts, and plains. They built 150 relay stations, bought 400 sturdy ponies, and hired about 80 riders. Their first mission was symbolic: deliver Lincoln's inaugural address to California faster than ever before. On April 3, 1860, the first rider galloped out of St. Joseph, mail pouch strapped tight. A crowd cheered. A legend was born. But the books told another story. Stations cost money. Horses needed care. Riders demanded wages. Equipment broke constantly. Pony Express was hemorrhaging cash, but the public didn't care. All eyes were on the riders, who braved storms, raids, and frozen rivers. They weren't just carrying letters. They carried the promise of unity in a fractured land. The riders were chosen carefully, or perhaps carelessly. They had to be young, wiry, and, ideally, orphans. If they died, no one would raise too much protest. Most were between 14 and 20 years old, weighing under 125 pounds. The famous advertisement read, "Wanted skinny, wiry fellows, not over 18, orphans preferred." It was half job listing, half dare. Those who answered were reckless, stubborn, and built for speed. Among the most celebrated was William Buffalo Bill Cody, though historians debate how much he actually rode. Still, the image of teenage Cody charging through hostile territory with only a pistol and a mail pouch cemented the Pony Express's place in legend. Then there was Pony Bob Haslam, who completed one of the longest and most dangerous rides in Express history. 120 meters through Butte territory with fresh arrows sticking out of his shoulder. These weren't just delivery boys. They were adrenaline junkies. Riders galloped through sleet and sandstorms, often riding day and night with little rest. They carried a mullah, a saddlebag designed to be easily tossed between horses, which held the sacred cargo, about 20 of letters, tightly packed and sealed in oilskin to protect against the elements. Every second mattered. Riders changed horses roughly every 10 to 15 meters, pausing only long enough to throw the mochila over a fresh saddle and gulp some water. Each rider would cover 75 to 100 miles in a single stretch, then collapse at a home station for food and rest, and then they'd do it all over again. Dangers lurked at every turn: bandits, wild animals, river crossings, and attacks by hostile groups defending their lands from intrusion. The express didn't carry weapons of war, but every rider had a revolver, a knife, and a lot of nerve. They rode alone through the night, often with no company except for the sound of hooves and the wind. Despite the danger, the Pony Express rarely failed to deliver. The mail got through, almost always. And in those fleeting 18 months, these teenage daredevils became legends, living, breathing symbols of American tenacity. While the riders got the glory, it was the network of relay stations, about 157 of them, that made the Pony Express work. Without them, there would have been no heroic dashes, number 10-day record times, and certainly no letters reaching Sacramento unscathed. These stations were the unsung heroes, scattered roughly every 10 to 15 miles across deserts, plains, and mountain passes like tiny islands of civilization in an ocean of wilderness. There were two main types: relay stations and home stations. Relay stations were simple affairs, bare-bone structures where a rider would swap out their exhausted horse for a fresh one. The exchange was a pit stop in the purest sense, often completed in under 2 minutes. Picture it: a kid barely old enough to vote, galloping in at full speed, flinging the Mosilla onto a waiting saddle, and bolting off again in a cloud of dust. Home stations were spaced about every 75 to 100 miles and served as the rider's resting point. Here, the young men could eat, sleep, and attempt to recover before heading out again. These were often operated by station keepers and their families living in isolated cabins or sodas with little more than a fireplace and a sense of duty. Mail delivery depended on them. A missed horse, a closed gate, or a sleepy attendant could cause hours of delay, and that was unacceptable. Life at these stations wasn't glamorous. Supplies were scarce. Stations in the high desert or deep plains had to fend off raids, survive brutal winters, and deal with wildlife ranging from rattlesnakes to wolves. Station keepers often lived with a rifle within arm's reach and slept with one eye open. And yet, the system worked most of the time. Horses were strategically placed. Riders followed strict timets. Each station served as a heartbeat in the grand circulatory system of the Pony Express. Miss a beat, and the whole organism suffered. But when it all clicked, it was magic. Messages that once took weeks suddenly arrived in 9 or 10 days. Letters sent from New York could pass through dozens of hands, hundreds of hooves, and across a continent's worth of peril, and still arrive ahead of schedule. The system was bold, fragile, and breathtakingly efficient, but it was also expensive. And now it was time to pay the bill. The Pony Express was fast, blazingly, unbelievably fast for its time, but speed came at a cost, and not just in risk, sweat, or the occasional horse that dropped dead mid-route. The cost was very real, very financial, and very unsustainable. From the very beginning, the Pony Express bled money. Operating across 100 miles of harsh terrain required enormous resources. Just building the infrastructure, stations, barns, corral, supply depots cost the founders around $200,000, a fortune in 1860. Then there were the horses. Hundreds of them, each bred for speed and endurance, not longevity. And of course, the riders and station workers all had to be paid barely. Each letter cost the customer $5 for half an ounce in the beginning. It's adjusted for inflation. That's roughly $170 today, just to send a short message. Even when the price eventually dropped to $1, it was still out of reach. For most Americans, the service was used mostly for urgent government or business correspondence. Think Wall Street, not grandma's birthday card. Despite all the daring, all the glory, the Pony Express was never a profitable enterprise. The founders, Russell, Major, and Weddell, had banked on securing a lucrative government mail contract, but that deal never came. The U.S. Post Office was reluctant to fund what many saw as a dangerous stunt, and political instability in the lead-up to the Civil War didn't help matters. By late 1860, the financial strain became unbearable. Horses needed feeding. Stations required constant upkeep. Riders had to be replaced, and all of this was funded out of pocket. Worse, the public perception of the Express as a kind of romantic adventure masked the brutal reality. It was a logistical nightmare running on borrowed time. Then came the knockout punch. In October 1861, the transcontinental telegraph was completed. Suddenly, a message could travel coast to coast in mere seconds. No horses, no riders, no risk, just dots and dashes over a wire. It was the future, cold, efficient, and utterly unstoppable. 2 days after the telegraph line opened, the Pony Express shut down. 18 months, that's all it lasted. But in that short span, it became legend. And not because it made money, but because it proved something bolder, that America could outpace its obstacles. On October 24th, 1861, a tiny but deafening revolution clicked into place across America. The final link of the transcontinental telegraph was completed, connecting the East Coast with the West for the first time in history by wire. With that one moment, the very thing the Pony Express had been designed to solve, speedy cross-country communication, was rendered obsolete. Messages that once took 10 days by horse could now be transmitted in minutes. It wasn't glamorous. There were no charging stallions or heroic riders racing through blizzards, trained telegraph operators tapping out Morse code into buzzing machines. But it worked, and it worked better than anyone expected. For the Pony Express, it was like trying to outrun lightning. You could be the fastest courier alive, but you couldn't beat the raw efficiency of electricity traveling down a copper wire. 2 days after that telegraph line was completed, the Pony Express officially folded. No dramatic finale, no farewell ride, just silence. Ironically, the same silence left behind after the last Morse signal went out each night. For Russell, Major, and Weddell, it was financial disaster. They had poured everything into the business, hoping to secure that elusive government contract. But the government, now enamored with the telegraph, saw little use for a horse-based mail system. The company was dissolved, its assets sold off, and its founders faded into bankruptcy or obscurity. And yet, for all its speed and progress, the telegraph didn't inspire the same kind of emotional resonance. You couldn't paint it in heroic brushstrokes. There were no ballads about clicking dots and dashes. The Pony Express, despite its failure, had the better story. Its riders became legends. Their exploits were retold in dime novels, stage plays, and eventually Western films. Even Buffalo Bill, whose actual involvement with the Express was likely exaggerated, built an entire career on the back of that legend, touring the world as a symbol of Wild West courage. So, while the telegraph won the race, the Pony Express won the myth. It represented a final gasp of old world adventure before America truly became wired, mechanized, and modern. Though the Pony Express galloped into history in just 18 months, its legend would outlive its brief lifespan by more than a century. Almost immediately after its shutdown, writers, journalists, and showmen began turning it into myth, a romantic tale of danger, speed, and rugged American spirit. The truth was already impressive, but truth wasn't enough. The public wanted something larger than life, so stories began to stretch. Riders were said to outrun native raiders, leap across canyons, and survive days without water. Historians raised an eyebrow. Readers, they bought the dime novels by the wagon load. No one capitalized on this better than Buffalo Bill Cody. though his actual time with the Pony Express remains murky. If it happened at all, Cody saw an opportunity. In his traveling Wild West show, Cody reenacted thrilling Pony Express rides before cheering crowds in Europe and across the United States. Kids grew up idolizing the image of the lone rider, braving the wilderness, a sack of urgent letters slung across his back. By the late 19th century, the Pony Express had become more than a failed mail service. It had become a national symbol of frontier bravery, of manifest destiny, of a time when a single weight of the nation's communication on his shoulders. Towns along the original route started commemorating the stations. Statues were built, plaques were placed in St. Joseph, Missouri, and Sacramento, California. Historical markers proudly declared, "Here began the Pony Express." School children were taught about the riders like they were founding fathers on horseback. And Hollywood, of course, came galloping in. Silent films, TV shows, and westerns featured exaggerated, believable versions of the Express, often ignoring how brutal, short-lived, and economically disastrous the real thing had been. Still, the romantic appeal endured. And maybe it's because the Pony Express tapped into something timeless. The idea that sheer determination and grit could overcome impossible odds. That youth and courage still mattered. That in the face of technology, there was still space for the human spirit to shine, if only briefly. So, even as the telegraph wires hummed overhead, and later telephone lines and satellites followed, the image of a young rider tearing across the plains never quite faded from the American imagination. The Pony Express didn't just deliver mail, it delivered a myth, a blueprint, a rugged silhouette of what Americans wanted to believe about themselves. In a country stitched together by ambition and risk, it became the perfect story. Bold, brief, tragic, and full of speed. At its heart, the Pony Express captured a uniquely American fantasy that one individual with enough courage and determination could carry the burden of a vast nation on their back. A teenage rider braving storms and arrows symbolized not just frontier grit, but youthful defiance against the impossible. It wasn't about efficiency, it was about heart. As the 20th century dawned and America entered the industrial age, that cowboy on a mission energy became a kind of nostalgic fuel. Railroads might have spanned the continent, and telegraphs might have connected cities in milliseconds, but those machines lacked soul. The Pony Express was the last time communication felt human, urgent, and heroic. It was the last romantic gasp before wires and gears replaced muscle and sweat. Politically, the story of the Pony Express was also convenient, painted the expansion westward as noble and exhilarating rather than messy, violent, or exploitative. School books taught it as a triumph of courage, not a story of risky capital investment or conflict with indigenous peoples. In this way, the Pony Express helped launder the more uncomfortable parts of American expansion into a feel-good narrative. A teenager galloping through the desert is easier to celebrate than a land dispute or a bankrupt freight company. Still, that doesn't diminish its impact. It proved that the West could be connected, that distance could be conquered. And even though the Express failed financially, it helped pave the way, literally and figuratively, for the infrastructure that would follow. The telegraph, the railroad, the transcontinental highway. In a way, the Express was America's awkward teenage phase. Bold ideas, clumsy execution, high ideals, and a few broken bones along the way. It was a short-lived miracle that set the stage for something bigger. And even now, when modern communication happens with a tap, there's still something stirring about a lone horseman galloping into the unknown. Somewhere, buried deep in the dust, is the reminder that progress once came on four legs and raw nerve. On October 26, 1861. Just 2 days after the transcontinental telegraph line went live, the last Pony Express rider galloped into Sacramento. There were no fireworks, no farewell parade, just a quiet end to one of the boldest communication experiments in American history. It was over, just like that. Okay. But that final ride wasn't a failure. In fact, it was a victory lap. Okay. The Express had done its job. IT had proven that a country as wide and wild as the United States could be connected quickly, reliably, and with human tenacity. Even though it was replaced by the flicker of telegraph signals, the Pony Express had set a standard. Urgency, bravery, and daring could still matter in a world of wires and machines. In the decades that followed, the Pony Express became almost mythological. Statues of galloping riders were raised in town squares. Reenactments were performed every July. Postal stamps commemorated its brief, breathless run. And historians, sometimes amused, sometimes in awe, continued to revisit those 18 months that changed how America imagined itself. It's easy to forget how fragile the whole thing was. Letters were carried in lightweight pouches that could be passed between riders in seconds. Horses were trained to run full tilt over cliffs, rivers, and mountains. Riders were barely old enough to grow a beard. There were ambushes, stampedes, and snowstorms. And still, against all odds, most of the mail made it on time. The Express also left behind something more subtle, a template for how Americans would view risk and reward. Silicon Valley founders and Wall Street gamblers often talk about Pony Express energy, bold moves made fast with the odds stacked against you. It's still used as a metaphor for trying something insane just because it might work, even if it doesn't. Today, when you send a message across the planet in a second, it's hard to grasp what 10 days on horseback meant, but that's the point. The Pony Express isn't remembered because it lasted, it's remembered because it tried. For one brief, shining moment, a bunch of kids on horseback outran the world, and though they were eventually passed by the telegraph, the telephone, and the internet, they did what few ventures ever do. They made history, and then they became legend, okay? And that more than speed is what made the Pony Express unforgettable. Before the violin found its place beneath the chins of concertmasters and soloists, before it filled opera houses and sonatas with aching emotion, it lived many lives under many names. Its story begins not in Italy, but far earlier in the vast windswept grasslands of Central Asia. Here, centuries ago, horsehair was strung across simple wooden boughs to stroke the strings of instruments like the marina and the rebab. These early bowed instruments, used by nomadic herders, produced low nasal tones that mimicked the human voice or the sounds of the animals they lived alongside. Okay? The idea was revolutionary, using friction rather than plucking or striking to sustain a note. Okay? It was the birth of an expressive technique that would echo across cultures. As trade routes flourished, these instruments moved westward along the Silk Road, through Persia into the Arab world, and eventually into southern Europe. The reed, in particular, was carried into moist Spain during the 8th and 9th centuries, where it mingled with local traditions. Meanwhile, the Byzantine Empire developed the lyra, another bowed instrument that would later influence Eastern European designs. Each culture added something, a different tuning, a new shape, an extra string. These instruments didn't evolve in a straight line. They branched like a family tree. In medieval Europe, the rebab gave rise to the viol and the fiddle, boxy bowed instruments held against the chest or tucked under the chin. These were the tools of wandering minstrels and church musicians playing simple melodies in taverns, streets, and courtly halls. Their sound was raw but intimate, their construction basic but clever. The bow had arrived, and with it, a new way of thinking about music, not as a sequence of short notes, but as a flowing, continuous voice. But these early fiddles were still crude compared to what was to come. Their shapes varied wildly. Their tuning was inconsistent. There was no standard form, no refined soundboard, no fingerboard optimized for agility. Still, in their wavering tones and handmade quirks, the violin's soul was beginning to stir. The concept was there, desire for something more agile, more emotional, more human. It was just waiting for the right hands in the right place at the right time. As the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance, Europe found itself awash in new ideas about art, science, and music. Among cathedrals and courts, a quiet transformation was taking place. The rough-hunted fiddles and viol of earlier centuries were being refined not only in appearance, but in purpose. Instruments were no longer just for dancing or liturgical drones. They were becoming vehicles for expression. By the 15th century, bowed string instruments had become common throughout Western Europe. You could hear them in taverns, weddings, noble chambers, and theaters, but no tool looked quite the same. The viol often had 5 strings, and its shape varied wildly from maker to maker. The Loretta Braccio, an Italian favorite, had a broad body and flat bridge, making it ideal for playing chords, popular with Renaissance poets and humanists who liked their verses set to music. But despite their growing popularity, these instruments still had limitations. Their sound lacked projection. The tuning systems were unreliable. Their design was too clumsy for true virtuosity. Musicians and composers began asking for more flexibility, more range, more clarity, more responsiveness, something that could sing like a voice, yet like a flute. At the same time, a quiet revolution was happening in instrument-making craftsmanship. Artisans across Italy and Germany were experimenting with curved wood, new varnishes, and more precise carving tools. They weren't just shaping wood, they were shaping resonance. Luire began to understand that the shape and thickness of the wood dramatically affected the sound it produced. Thinner tops vibrated better. Rounded backs projected further. Arched bridges allowed for individual string playing. Musical tastes were evolving, too. Composers began writing more intricate parts for bowed instruments. The demand wasn't just for rhythm or harmony. It was for melody, for something lyrical and soloistic. Stage was being set for a new type of instrument to emerge, one that was compact, agile, and expressive. Europe had all the ingredients, the centuries-old lineage of bowed instruments, the artistic energy of the Renaissance, and a new class of master builders ready to carve out the future. All that was missing was someone bold enough to reimagine the instrument from the ground up. And in the small Italian town of Cremona, that someone instruments. Building on the LRA de Brazio and other Renaissance fiddles, Amati streamlined the body shape, refined the arch top and back, and standardized the proportions. His creations weren't experiments, they were templates. He introduced the F-shaped sound holes, which allowed better sound projection and helped stabilize the structure. His instruments were smaller, lighter, and more responsive than anything before. And importantly, he tuned them in perfect fifths, a tuning system that gave the violin its uniquely vocal and agile range. By the mid-1500s, Amati's violins were being commissioned by royalty, including King Charles I of France, who ordered a set of 24 instruments for his court. These weren't just musical tools. They were status symbols, hand-painted and gilded, blending engineering and visual art. Cremona quickly became the epicenter of violin-making excellence. Other families followed the Amati tradition, most notably the Guarneri and Stradivari dynasties. They didn't just copy Amati, they refined, stretched, and deepened his vision. Okay, the violins coming out of Cremona were no longer anonymous workshop items. Okay, they were signed works of genius, each with its own tone and of the Amati workshop, but he quickly moved beyond imitation. What he created in the late 17th and early 18th centuries would become the gold standard, not just of violins, but of musical craftsmanship itself. Stradivarius' instruments weren't merely beautiful. They were transcendent with a keen eye for wood selection, subtle asymmetry and shaping, and a still mysterious varnish that added depth both visually and sonically. Stradivari violins possessed a tone that was clear, powerful, and hauntingly warm. They could project to the back of a concert hall, yet whisper intimately. Baroque orchestra, where strings already formed the foundation. Violin sections first and second emerged to provide harmony and melody. Composers like Bach and Handel gave the violin prominent roles in their canatos and orchestral suites, but it was still part of an ensemble identity. There were no massive string sections yet, just tight, intimate groups. Then came the classical era and everything expanded. Composers such as Haydn and Mozart shaped the modern symphony, and the violin took center stage. Haydn, often called the father of the symphony, built rich, balanced orchestral textures. Drama. By the Romantic era, orchestras had ballooned in size, and the violin was king. Brahms, Tchaikovsky, Dvorak, and others gave the violin lush melodies and heroic passages, both in symphonies and concertos. The orchestral violinist had to master nuance, endurance, and ensemble coordination, all while keeping up with rapidly evolving musical complexity. Canas, too, began relying on the concertmaster, the lead violinist, not just to lead the section, but to bridge the gap between conductor and orchestra. In many ways, the concertmaster became second in command, responsible for tuning, bowings, and cultures. In classical music, the violin remains essential. Young prodigies dazzle on global stages, playing concertos written centuries ago with fresh emotion and technical brilliance. International competitions like the Queen Elizabeth or the Menu Cane launch careers and keep the classical tradition alive and fiercely competitive. But there's a shift happening. More players are challenging tradition, pushing the boundaries of what the violin can be. Contemporary composers are writing for the violin in new ways, using extended techniques, electronics, loops, and non-Western. That the instrument's appeal isn't just sonic. It's visual, emotional, personal. Education, too, is evolving. With YouTube tutorials, online masterclasses, and digital sheet music, the violin is more accessible than ever. A student in Nairobi or Limmer can learn from a Juilliard professor with the tap of a screen. But alongside this democratization comes a challenge. How to preserve depth and discipline in a world obsessed with speed. Still, through all the noise, the violin endures. Why? Because it is, and always has been, an extension of the human voice. It cries like we do. It sings